So good evening and welcome. Thank you for being with us. My name is Kevin Funk. I'm a faculty member in the Committee on Global Thought here at Columbia, also affiliated with the Department of Political Science and the Institute of Latin American Studies. It's wonderful for you to be joining us for this conversation that we are co-sponsoring along with Security and Context, of which Omar Dahi, seated here, who's a professor of economics at Hampshire College, is the director, and he'll say a few words about that in just a moment. For those of you who do not know about the Committee on Global Thought, we are a program and an intellectual space dedicated to analyzing and interrogating all sorts and all manners of global phenomena and their intersections with the local. And we host numerous events and initiatives, including public programs like this one. And so today we have the distinct privilege to be joined by the co-editors of, and the contributing authors to, two of the contributing authors to, a new volume published in 2022 by Oxford University Press, entitled On the Trail of Capital Flight. Copy here that I'll hold up for the camera as well. And the subtitle then, The Takers and the Enablers. This book investigates the dynamics of capital flight from Angola, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa, countries that have witnessed large-scale illicit financial outflows in recent decades. And the book examines the who, the how, and the where of this phenomenon. As the authors note, the evidence reveals a complex transnational network of actors and enablers, as they put it, who are involved in orchestrating and facilitating capital flight and the accumulation of private wealth in offshore secrecy jurisdictions. This underscores, as they argue, the reality that capital flight is a global phenomenon and that measures to curtail it are a shared responsibility for Africa and the global community. Our two guests, Léonce Ndikumana, is a distinguished professor and director of the African Development Policy Program in the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And James Boyce is a senior fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst also, where he is also professor emeritus of economics. Thank you very kindly for traveling to be with us today and enduring the traffic and so forth as well. I'll have the pleasure of serving as moderator for this event. I should note, however, that unfortunately, due to a last-minute schedule change, Christina Duarte, who's Undersecretary General and Special Advisor on Africa to the UN Secretary General, will not be able to be with us to be able to discuss it. So I'm going to first give the floor to Omar, who's going to provide some other brief remarks before we get started. Then we're going to have a presentation about the book itself, and we will also have time before reception for conversation, comments, questions, and so forth. So over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll make this quick. Hi, everybody. I'm Omar Dahi. I'm, as Kevin mentioned, the Director of Security and Context, which is a research network that was launched about 3 years ago to provide critical and alternative perspectives on global affairs from a global South perspective. We're very pleased to be co-organizing this and thankful for the Committee on Global Thought, of whom we share many overlapping interests for this. Thank you to Kevin, Sophia, Reinhold, everyone who really put a lot of work into making this possible. Security and Context is mainly driven by research. We have 4 main research tracks: multipolarity and the global South, redefining security, transnational war economies, and class, race, gender, and insecurity. And a lot of our research is done in collaboration with organizations and individuals in the global South. In addition, we have public policy programming, and this is really one of our key kind of outputs that we have in collaboration with organizations across the US. This is our first in New York, and hopefully we can do several with the Committee on Global Thought. The topic of today's book and research is really something that is hits on issues that are very close to us, because part of what Security and Context is about is not just criticizing kind of dominant frameworks about security issues, whether they're kind of military or kind of economic security issues, but also setting a new agenda. And I think the research that Leonce, James, and their colleagues do is really, it's technical, but it's key because it touches on issues that are of immense significance for societies, particularly in the global South and in the African context, as they're going to talk about. It's a great book. If you read it, you'll also see why Manhattan is a particularly appropriate venue for this launch. The authors will talk about that perhaps a little bit in their remarks. So thank you very much for coming. There's flyers if you haven't picked them up in the back. Our website is securityincontext.org. Please sign up. We have only once a month newsletter, so we won't bombard your inbox. So with that, thank you for coming.
Yes, and please go ahead.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. This is a great opportunity for us to be here. Again, Jim will tell you why this is one of the best places to be presenting this. So this book is a collaborative effort by a number of people who contributed by writing case studies to give you. So what we're going to do is have two segments of the presentation. My part will give you the context and the overview of the project that led to this and the key findings at the aggregate level, country level. Then Jim will talk about the global perspective of this problem that we call capital flight. So everybody who reads or writes or studies work in Africa has heard many things about the African continent. We have heard things about the continent being a lost, that there is no hope. You remember the 80s, the lost decades, the 90s, and then suddenly Africa started being labeled as the rising continent. Lions on the move, terms that have been expressed. But when you travel the continent, you actually sometimes wonder, which part am I dealing with? Am I dealing with the rising part, or am I dealing with the lost decades, or the continent with no hope? So it's interesting to ask ourselves, when we say the continent is rising, that growth is expanding, that there's a renaissance in Africa. For whom is that happening? Who is benefiting? You have heard that Africa is one of the most endowed continent in terms of natural resources, and that is true. But when you travel the continent again, sometimes you wonder, where do all those resources go? Because they are being exploited, and some of them really, really fast. Somebody's benefiting from them, both the domestic elite and the global corporations, multinational corporations. And what you find is that basically it seems that the story never stops. It's like the old story before colonization, the King Leopold coming to the Congo and exploiting resources, and the Belgians coming to Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo, taking the minerals and going build the European economies. And now it's not the states, it's the corporations that are doing exactly the same thing. So capital flight is a reflection of that continuation of unequal exchange between Africa and the rest of the world, unequal trade, where Africa gets the short end of the stick. And what we do in this book is to try to illustrate those phenomena with examples drawing on three countries: Angola, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa. But we also, in doing so, we take a very critical approach to a critical analytical framework, where we interrogate some of the things that we take for granted as economists, as political scientists, as historians, and so on. So, for example, all the phenomena we are describing take place in the context of a globalized financial system. When I actually have to confess, I'm teaching money and banking now, and what we tell students is that the financial system improved the working of the economic system by facilitating mobilization of resources, moving money from those who have the money to those who need the money, and by improving efficiency of allocation of resources. So when you see money moving from one place to the other, theory tells us that you should be happy that money is moving from one place to moving to the other where it is better used. Okay, but then we say, what's happening for Africa? Why is it that money keeps flowing out of the continent? Theory would tell us that it's because outside of the continent, money finds better use, higher returns. But the reality is that when we do the analysis, we actually find that returns to capital are much higher in the continent. But also, the continent has much greater needs for capital than the rest of the world. So if it was rational, was any rationality in the movement of capital, it would flow from the rest of the world to Africa. But also, the role of the private sector comes into play very, very much, because many times when you say Africa is having trouble, people will say, oh, it's just Africa, it's corruption, it's bad governance, it's the bad government. But actually, things go bad because it's not just the government, but also the private operators. It's the multinational corporations, the entrepreneurs that collude with bad governance, bad politicians, to exploit the resources of Africa on the benefit of the elite. So when we look at our findings, we find that there is this very close connection between natural resources and capital flight, as if countries that are endowed in natural resources are almost doomed to the problem of capital flight, underdevelopment. But then you wonder, is it really capital flight? Is it really natural resources? It's just oil that makes a country exposed to capital flight. Bad governance is a key issue. I want to read from the book a segment that basically emphasizes that point about the linkages between capital flight and natural resources. So capital flight is widespread across the African continent, but it varies significantly from country to country, with resource-rich countries being typically more exposed than their less well-endowed counterparts. Two key mechanisms of capital flight are the misinvoicing of commodity exports and embezzlement of export revenues in state-owned mineral and oil companies. The association of capital flight with natural resources is one manifestation of what is sometimes called the resource curse. This association appears to be particularly pronounced in the case of oil-rich countries, which in Africa tend to be more poorly governed. The issue is not resource endowments per se, but the quality of governance in the concerned countries. Lamenting the inadequacy of economic progress in her country, former President of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, remarked, "I've often said that Liberia is not a poor country, but a rich country that has been poorly managed. The same is true for most of sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's crisis was a failure of leadership and management. Sub-Saharan Africa is rich in resources, talent, and energy and spirit, but it has not been rich in leadership. It is made up of countries that were poorly managed, and the results have been disastrous. Capital flight can be understood as a result and symptom of an environment that incentivizes and facilitates the smuggling of domestic resources to offshore havens." So capital flight is a very complex phenomenon that involves both economic aspects and political aspects, governance aspects. And in general, it's easy, as I said, it's easy to blame Africa for being corrupt and therefore they lose their resources because they can't manage them. But if Africa, I keep saying that, if Africa was the only continent that's corrupt, then money will not find a place to go. Because a non-corrupt country will not welcome corrupt money. So capital flight happens because there is bad governance at the source in African countries, but also really, really bad governance and responsibility at the destination. So because financial centers are happy to welcome African money, even if it is dirty, illicit, because it fuels their economies. So it's a global phenomenon. And if you want to solve the problem, you don't just focus on the origin, You have to look at the whole system. So why do we care about capital flight? For African countries, of course, the money that's leaving Africa is money that could have been used to build hospitals, to build schools, to build roads. So it basically derails all the efforts that governments are doing to improve development. At the destination, in the destination countries also, there are actually some bad effects, which we call blowback effects, which Jim is going to develop. But then from a donor perspective, there is also a concern for donors who are making efforts to support developing countries. They should be worried about capital flight, because in our analysis, we found that one of the sources of capital flight, the things that fuel capital flight is aid, debt that countries are borrowing from the rest of the world, which then turns around and goes back in foreign banks in a phenomenon that's called revolving door. So in our calculations, we found that for every dollar that comes to Africa as borrowed money, up to 60 cents go back as capital flight. Yet, the continent has to repay the whole thing. So we are basically seeing a situation where the African people have to shoulder the burden of the full borrowed amount of money when they actually did not benefit from it. And sometimes it's not just they don't benefit from it, sometimes the money is used to buy guns to kill them. So it's a problem, it's a serious problem of not just development problem, but also governance problem, but also it has ethical dimensions. So in our estimation, we find that the continent over the past 4-5 decades has lost a lot of money through capital flight. These are the estimates we have from 1970 to 2018. So in total, Africa has lost $2 trillion from capital flight. This is money that goes out of a country without without being recorded. Money that goes through in suitcases, money that goes through trade misinvoicing, which means export under invoicing and import over invoicing, in the sense that people export coffee, tea, minerals, and declare less than they have sold for. And people go to the central bank to ask for money to import cars and everything, and they say they're going to import 100 million worth of cars. So they get 100 million worth of dollars, but actually buy for 60 and leave the rest abroad. So all that accumulates into private wealth. So to get a sense of what is 2 trillion, that's basically the size of the sub-Saharan African economies combined. So all sub-Saharan African countries combined, in terms of GDP, that money has gone out. On an annual basis, we estimate about $60 billion going out of the continent. That's more than the amount of aid coming up from to Africa, more than the FDI, more than remittances. So when people tell you Africa is heavily dependent on aid, heavily dependent on debt, that gives you a pause. Does Africa have to be dependent on aid? No. If Africa could keep this money that's leaking out of the continent, they would not have to need aid. And especially since some of the money that's coming, it goes back. So it's a very, very unequal, unfair system. So what we do then is use the country study to go into more details, to look at how does this happen? It happens because there are certain things that are not working at the source and at the destination. So we're looking at mechanisms and channels of capital flight. I already mentioned some. It's misinvoicing of exports and imports, embezzlement of borrowed money and aid, and all that in the context of a poor regulatory environment. But also that means that there is failure of state institutions that are responsible for managing the resources, for disciplining the private sector, and many times it's because the state institutions have been captured by private operators in what we call state capture. In the book, in the chapter on South Africa, we profiled the case of a family, famous rich family called the Gupta's family, which basically had penetrated the whole inner circles of the state, including all the way to the president, to the point where they were able to extract wealth from all sectors of the economy, including parastatals, by overbidding the government on every contract. And in doing so, they were helped by very powerful law firms, consulting firms, which sometimes worked on both sides. So the same law firm, the consulting firm is advising the government and advising the private company to steal the money. So again, I talked about the resource plunder, and we took these three countries because they share some interesting features. All three countries have suffered from capital flight significantly. South Africa it ranks number 2 in terms of the volume of capital flight after Nigeria. Angola ranks number 3, and then Côte d'Ivoire ranks number 7. But all of them are very rich in natural resources. Angola, oil. Côte d'Ivoire, almost everything. But in this book, we focus on cocoa. And then South Africa prides itself on being the most industrialized country, diversified, and so on, but also have a lot of minerals. But at the same time, those countries have nothing to show for those resources. Poverty is endemic in Angola. Côte d'Ivoire is the #1 exporter of cocoa, but the Ivorian cocoa farmers are as poor as anybody else, because the money does not go to the farmers. It goes to the big companies that are processing chocolate or coffee, chocolate that we are consuming here. In the case of South Africa, again, very rich in mineral resources, diversified, a very good financial system. But at the same time, it's a country that has struggled to fight against poverty. In fact, in the latest numbers, it's as if poverty has stopped declining. It declined a little bit from the mid-90s, and then now it stopped, and then it's going up. But what's really going up is inequality. Inequality is much higher today than it was under apartheid. It's painful to watch. In fact, South Africa is tagged as the most unequal country. If you go to South Africa, fly over, if you land in Cape Town, for example, the first thing you see is shanty towns, and then, of course, the villas on the base of the mountains. It's like it's two countries. Why? Because that's how it was built, and it hasn't changed. And capital flight makes it difficult to change that, because the resources to help the people are going up, and they are in the hands of the rich people. So quickly, in terms of our finding, we find that all these countries have lost a lot of money, and these amounts make more sense when you actually think about what could have been done if this money had been kept. For Angola, for example, 133 billion, you say, what is that? 4.2 billion a year. That's half. I mean, if you could keep that, imagine how much you can increase the spending on health. Health, 2 billion per year. Okay. For Côte d'Ivoire, 55 billion, 1.1 billion a year, nearly the same as what's being spent on health. You could double the spending on health. For South Africa, 29 billion, 15 billion per year. Health expenditures, 27. Again, it means that these are hospitals that are not being built. This is equipment in hotels, hospitals and schools that are not being purchased. And then we go country by country, but how much time do I have? I think I have already.
Yeah, take a few more minutes.
Okay, I'm going to skip the details on each countries, and then this is a very interesting fact that I mentioned here to get a sense of how African countries are being robbed. Is you take any resource. If you did this for copper, you find the same thing. For gold, you find the same thing. And think about the people who are sweating every day, producing cocoa. How much do they get? In this case, take the international value of what comes out of cocoa is the most processed products, like chocolate. 51% goes to the companies that process the products. You know how much goes to the cocoa grower? 4%. You will never get developed with 4% of the value of your product. It's impossible. Because the rest is going to people who have capital. The farmers have their hands in their land, but people who have money end up getting everything. For South Africa, we look at the role of mineral resources, how they are a source of capital flight. And one key feature that we find in all mineral-rich countries is that they have a hard time knowing where the minerals are going. In South Africa, the number one importer of gold from South Africa is India. When you go into South African books, you find very little gold. I'm doing a study on Zambia. The same thing. You find that Zambia in Zambia's book, most of the gold goes to South Africa. You go to South Africa, there is no gold coming from Zambia. You say, where did the gold go? I have no idea. So I think the whole trading, I was talking about the financial system, but it's also the trading system that really shortchanged Africa in the sense that the value chain is so opaque that you don't even know what's the value of your copper because you can't know who bought it the last time, who was the last buyer of your cocoa. And that's why countries are not benefiting from their resources. The other thing we find in this analysis is that capital flight is made possible because of a very close network of operators. In the case of South Africa, we're trying to see who participate in this scheme of milking the state and the state enterprises, misinvoicing minerals. And we find that there is nearly everybody. There are politicians who get kickbacks and bribes, and some of them also are investors in big companies. In South Africa, we find that the family of Zuma was in every company that was relevant. Then connected individuals, I mentioned the case of the Guptas, and corporations. Here, the case of Glencore is very, very interesting because if you go to any African countries that has mineral, Glencore is there. But then many times you find it's not Glencore proper that's there. It's an affiliate of Glencore, which allows Glencore to make up numbers when they determine their profits in the country. So they make no profit in the country. They make the profit in Bermuda, in the low tax jurisdiction. So they pay no taxes in Africa. They're taking the minerals. What does Africa have to show? Destroyed environment. And the foreign exchange doesn't come because you don't even know where the exports went. Then you have also banks, domestic and foreign, and then consulting firms. I mentioned the fact that in South Africa, capital flight has really real human cost in terms of underdevelopment. This picture can tell you a million words without saying anything. On the right, you have a settlement which calls Macross, where people are just fighting every day to survive, to eat. On the left, you have a very wealthy neighborhood near Johannesburg, Primrose. And of course, in the middle, there is a war because you want to separate the poor from the rich. It reminded me, I lived in Ethiopia, and every time there was a big meeting, and in Ethiopia there are, yes, many poor people in Addis Ababa, many people begging on the street. But when there was an international meeting 2 days before, the beggars disappeared. They just load them in buses, take them outside of Addis Ababa. Here, it's like, yeah, you want to keep the poor not too far from you because you need them to work for you, but not too close because, they don't look good. That's the image. I mean, you go to Cape Town, you see the same. You go to Pretoria, you see the same. The other thing that, again, I mentioned is high inequality, in the sense that the rich capture most of the wealth here. The rich capture 19%, but actually the inequality is much higher if you look at wealth rather than income. Actually, wealthy people don't have income. It's the ordinary people like you who work, we have income. Wealthy people have wealth. Their wealth works for them. Okay, that's why wealth inequality is always much higher. But also, what's striking is that this inequality is actually rising. This is the composite measure of inequality, much higher today than it was during the apartheid regime. Whether you look at the Gini coefficient or the share of the top 1%. And that is what I mentioned before. Poverty, there was some hope that poverty was declining in the beginning of the 2000s, but now poverty seems to be stagnating, actually rising in some measures. And that's really because of the rising inequality. The country may be generating wealth, but it stays at the top, and the poor are still struggling. So capital flight, again, is a concern because it worsens poverty inequality, because those who own the wealth that's being stashed abroad are the rich. So the gap keeps increasing. Moreover, when there is a shock to the economy, like now many African countries are still suffering from COVID, Ukraine war, and so on, for the rich people, their money is here. They are not suffering from the shocks affecting African countries. So again, inequality keeps rising. So who is going to fight for the poor? It's not the rich, because they like the way the system is. The status quo works for the rich. So it's a very, very big issue. There's an uphill struggle, but somehow something has to be done. Because I get worried very much when you have a country that claims to be developing when the majority is moving backwards, getting worse. Things are getting worse. You cannot hold the majority of the population in poverty forever. I was in Tunisia when the Arab Spring started. Do you know why it started? Because the young people had lost hope. They finish school, they try to survive, they can't. The police pushes them out of the street when they're trying to sell their vegetables. And then this young man says, well, life is nothing. So he goes, puts a tie around his body and tortures himself. That's the challenge I have with African countries now. Huge problem of youth inequality. And the governments, instead of having money to help the young people, money is going to enrich the rich people outside. We go to Jim, who's going to talk about the global aspect of capital flight.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I want to just briefly add a few points to what Léonce has described for you, trying to position this problem within the context of features that we see as important aspects of the economy of the entire world. And as Léonce said, I want to try to bring out some of the ways in which capital flight, not only from Africa, but from other parts of the world, adversely impacts the destination countries as well as adversely impacting the majority of people in the source countries. So Léonce has already gone through the numbers. They're huge. They exceed flows of aid, remittances, and foreign direct investment. These numbers, by the way, are created basically through forensic statistical work, which is described in the book. It involves the measure of capital flight is a measure of unrecorded outflows of capital, money that dollars or foreign exchange that comes in and disappears, doesn't show up in any of the country's legitimate uses of foreign exchange. The point I really want to emphasize is that this is not simply an African problem. If we look at where the capital flight goes, it's flowing to many other countries that are implicated in the problem as well. And then there's also capital flight from Latin America, from Asia, from the former Soviet republics. These are all big financial flows that are happening in the kind of the shadow world, if you will, of international finance. You can't find the numbers in official documents. You have to look for the spaces where the numbers are missing, so to speak. A lot of it flows to the United States. The phenomenon that we describe in the book is one that we describe as transnational plunder networks, to try to emphasize the transnational characteristics of this phenomenon. So on one hand, you have the folks we described as the takers, the folks that are involved in appropriating, extracting resources, the initial acquisition of funds that ultimately find their way out of the country in the form of capital flight. And these include appropriators of resources, the folks who manage to establish control over choke points in the economy, in other words, monopolies of one type or another, which very often turns out to be a lucrative source of enrichment, and politically exposed persons who often are involved in, these are overlapping categories, so they're often involved in resource appropriation and choke point manipulation, multinational firms, corrupt public officials. And then on the enabling side, on the side that helps get this money out of the country and hide it in places where it's relatively difficult to find, not impossible, but difficult, we have banks, trusts, investment advisors, accountants, lawyers, consulting firms, real estate brokers, and others. This is just a partial list, but it gives you a sense of who the players are that we're talking about. And in the book, we, in the case studies on Angola, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa, written by our collaborators, in the case of South Africa, Léonce was one of the principal authors as well. We put a lot of flesh on that, on these bones, by describing who did what to whom and how. Art dealers even come in on the enabler side. The interplay between forces that we describe in the book was summed up rather nicely, we think, by Mobutu, the ruler of what was then called Zaire, now is called the Democratic Republic of Congo, when he commented, "It takes two to corrupt, the corrupter and the corrupted. It takes two to have, in fact, more than two, to have the phenomenon of large-scale capital flight that we've documented in this and in other work." When we think about financial power in the world, often the juxtaposition is made between the global north and the global south. And we think that's an important axis to think about and try to understand, but overlaid is another axis, which are on the one side, these folks we call the transnational plunder networks, and on the other side, the legitimate economy. And that axis, in a way, transects the others. The transnational plunder networks involve people from the south and from the north, and the legitimate economy does too. And that too is an axis of very important tension and conflict, and really incompatible interests at the end of the day. Thinking about sites of appropriation, of plunder. Léonce has already mentioned the resource curse, sometimes called the paradox of plenty, that many countries that are very well endowed with natural resources are also very poor. The resources become a lure, much as they were in colonial times, really, with that process continuing. Within the metropolitan countries, the colonial countries, the colonizing countries, over time, the rule of law gets enshrined and more or less enforced and legitimized and becomes a norm. But when the same actors move outside the space of the metropolitan states, it's more a kind of free-for-all, anything goes, Wild West kind of situation. And we see this on display in resource exploitation most vividly. Léonce has already talked about cocoa. This is an illustration of the choke point site of appropriation, where those who control there are many growers of cocoa. There are 3 firms that basically control the market for Ivorian cocoa. It sometimes is described as the Saudi Arabia of cocoa. If you eat chocolate, a lot of your chocolate comes from Côte d'Ivoire. And the division of money reflects the incredible power of controlling those choke points. Another site of appropriation, which Léonce has mentioned, are financial inflows in the form of external borrowing, both from official development institutions and from private banks, and the phenomenon of the revolving door, whereby a fraction of that money gets diverted, sometimes very directly, sometimes through multiple indirect channels, and winds up going back out of the country clandestinely, sometimes into the same accounts in the same banks that lent the money. Of course, the money that's out of the country is held by private individuals, and the borrowing is the responsibility of the state, of the government. If it's not public borrowing, if it was private borrowing, it came with a public guarantee, so that when the borrower defaults, it becomes a liability of the state. As we've written elsewhere, when you really dig into this particular phenomenon, this was the focus of our earlier book, Africa's Odious Debts, you begin to question the term debt forgiveness. People talk about, oh, poor Africa, they can't service their debts. Should we forgive those debts or not? What conditions should be attached to forgiving the debts? And when you look at the dynamics of what goes on, from the standpoint of many African people, you could be excused for thinking the real thing is whether we should forgive the creditors for what they've done to our polities and societies. What I really want to focus on in the last few minutes here are what we call the blowback effects. The effects here in the developed, advanced, industrialized countries, which really underscores why we think this is a problem that people in the US, in Europe, should also be concerned with. It's not just that ordinary Africans are harmed by this phenomenon. Ordinary Americans, ordinary British people, ordinary French people are harmed as well. And I want to lift up and highlight 3 of those harms. One is financial instability, the second is the urban property market squeeze, and the third is the corrosion of the rule of law. So as an example of the financial instability that is connected with these phenomena that we document in the book, the collapse of Banco Espírito Santo is an outstanding example. Banco Espírito Santo, for those of you unfamiliar with it, was Portugal's oldest banking dynasty. It collapsed in 2014. A key factor in that collapse was billions of dollars of unsecured loans that had been made by its Angolan subsidiary to politically well-connected individuals, loans that ultimately spun that revolving door of capital flight. And ultimately, the Central Bank of Portugal had to take over BES, and the financial collapse sent shockwaves through European financial markets at the time. So these kinds of illicit activities often come at a cost, and one of those costs is destabilization of a financial system, which is built on the idea that most financial activity, most loans, for example, are going to be legitimate. Some of them may not get paid back, things can go wrong, you allow for that, but the idea that on a wholesale basis, going bad is the norm rather than the exception undermines the stability of the system, as you will appreciate. A second example of blowback effects is the squeeze on urban property markets in metropolitan centers around the world, including here in Manhattan. So a few of you may recall that back in 2015, the New York Times ran a series of articles, to my mind, an extraordinarily good job of investigative journalism, in which they documented the phenomenon of sales of real estate in urban markets in the United States to shell companies. Shell companies, in other words, entities whose beneficial owners, the people whose money it was, are unknown. These are anonymous owners. They're shell companies set up in often offshore jurisdictions. And they looked at sales of what they defined as high-end real estate, residential real estate, which in the case of Manhattan at the time, they defined as properties with a value of more than $4 million. You would probably up that a little bit now, perhaps. And what they found was that in Manhattan, in the previous year, over half of the sales of high-end real estate were to shell companies. Now, why is this a problem for ordinary people who live and work in New York City? Well, if you think about it for a minute, you've got at the high end of the real estate market, you've got a lot of the property being locked up by anonymous owners who in fact don't live there, who often don't even visit there or rarely visit there. They're just sitting there, right? But they're squeezing out others who would be bidding for those same residential properties, right? And so the people who can't afford to get into those properties anymore because they're being acquired by offshore shell companies, basically by dirty money, they have to move down in the sort of cascade of real estate markets into a lower tier where they in turn bid up prices. And the people who they're outbidding in turn get pushed down and they bid up prices and the cascade falls down. So you find an escalation in property values and rents, but property values especially, such that a lot of people, this isn't news to any of you who live here in New York, a lot of people who work here can't afford to live here, right? Which, when you think about it, from the standpoint of ordinary people, that's a big problem. Now, I'm not saying capital flight is the only reason for that problem. There are other, housing and all this, these are complex issues. But it's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's one that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. The Times story not only documented Manhattan, but looked at Los Angeles. Again, more than 50% of buyers using shell companies. Looked at the San Francisco Bay Area, almost half. Looked at Miami, over a third, right? This is a ubiquitous phenomenon in the big money center metropolitan cities of the world. And in Europe, you find it in London on a massive scale. You can find it in other European capitals. You can find it in Singapore and Hong Kong as well, actually. So that's a second set of blowback effects that I think we ought to be concerned with. And then finally, I want to conclude by mentioning, my animation got a little bit messed up here, the corrosion of the rule of law as a third blowback effect. Because, capital flight, a good metaphor for capital flight is disease, right? It's like a disease of the financial system, right? A pathology. And much as diseases spread across countries internationally, as we vividly have seen in the last few years, similarly, the corrosion of the rule of law that results from these corrupt processes that we've sketched spread across countries and corrode the rule of law, not only in Africa, but also in other countries. A good example of that was the Aquitaine scandal, which was described as the biggest corporate sleaze scandal to hit a Western democracy since World War II. It involved the big French oil company, which basically was paying commissions to middlemen for contracts for exploiting oil in Africa, especially, not only in Africa. And money from those commissions was going into offshore accounts, which were then being used to pay kickbacks to those behind the deals. And secret accounts that were generated along the way were secret accounts held by the company, were used to channel money to French and African politicians and political parties, not only as cash, but also paying for mistresses, villas, a lot of the perks of power. Eva Joly, who was the French magistrate who led the investigation when this scandal broke, compared state corruption that she was uncovering to the mafia. And she said, the same networks, the same henchmen, the same banks, and the same marble villas are involved in both domains, both the formally illegal activities of organized crime and the off the books activities of folks who we don't normally think of as part of the organized crime networks. The scandal, by the way, led to the conviction of the foreign minister, Roland Dumas. And after he was convicted, he said, ELF, the company, was one of the cash cows of the Republic. It served to maintain good relations with African heads of state and irrigated certain networks and financed certain people. It was very well known the system had been in place for a very long time. And his position was that he was simply a fall guy. They had to, somebody's head had to roll, and it was his. But really, he was not like a bad apple in a otherwise clean barrel. This was the system operating beneath the surface. If we were talking about Russian oligarchs' dirty money and the corrosion of the rule of law, I don't have to tell you that we could come up with contemporary examples closer to home. So let me, that's the book. Those are the table of contents. I want to close out by just reading a brief passage. It's the first page of the conclusion of the book, which kind of wraps up a lot of what Léonce and I have tried in a very compressed way to present to you here. In the make-believe world of the perfect neoclassical economy, capital flight from sub-Saharan Africa would be a cruel irony. In a world of perfect markets, abnormally high profits would arise only as a reward for productivity-enhancing innovations, a temporary bonus while other producers catch up. In a world of perfect property rights, assets would change hands only through voluntary exchanges at mutually agreed prices. Floating alongside the perfect market would be the perfect state, impartially enforcing the rules and efficiently providing public goods and services. Natural resources like oil, hard minerals, and fertile land would be a sheer blessing, not a curse. Guided by the invisible hand of self-interest, capital would flow to investments wherever they yield the highest return, and hence from places where capital is relatively abundant to places where it is scarce. The real world depicted in this book operates quite differently. Far from being perfect, markets are often riddled with imperfections. They routinely confer persistent, excessive profits to those who wield control of choke points in the economy. Property rights are neither perfectly defined nor perfectly secure. Instead, powerful actors are guided, as if by an invisible hand, to opportunities for appropriation, capture, and outright theft. Governments are neither impartial nor efficient. Propelled by the interplay between power and wealth, their central objectives morph from serving the public to serving the elite. Natural resources are a hunting ground for rapid wealth extraction and accumulation, and capital flows across borders are driven not by relative scarcity, but by the relative secrecy available in offshore havens. In this all too real world, capital flight from Africa and other so-called poor countries across the world, more accurately, countries most of whose people are desperately poor, comes as no surprise. It is not ironic, simply cruel. So that's what I will leave you with. I wanted to mention that our earlier book, which is you can still find for sale on Amazon and so on, is out there. The paperback edition of our new book just came out a couple months ago here in the States. We've got had a few copies of it. They're gone. All right, so I won't even mention that. You got a flyer. The discount code from OUP may still work. And you can find it on Amazon, et cetera, too. And I wanted to mention that there are some other really excellent works on this topic as well. These are three recent books, all of which are really worth reading. Nick Shaxson, the author of the third book, is the author of the Angola study in our book. And I also wanted to mention, finally, that if you're interested in who's doing anything about these problems, which might come up in our Q&A, I wanted to mention in particular two groups that I think have done really good work. And if you check out their websites, you can learn more about them and what they're doing, and about current legislative initiatives and other initiatives here in the US and elsewhere to address these problems. One is the FACT Coalition. FACT stands for Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency. It's a coalition of more than 100 organizations. It's based in DC. They've got a website. They've got a lot of resources. They really are fighting the good fight. The other is the Tax Justice Network, which is an international coalition of people working to develop a more fair and transparent tax system, and also to combat illicit financial flows. So I'll stop there, and we're happy, and we're sorry for going on so long, of course, and happy to take questions in whatever time we have remaining.
So thank you for shedding light in the shadow world, as you put it, and helping us to make sense of this very difficult topic and a very important one. So we do have some time for questions. We'll take 10 or 15 minutes. We want to make sure we have time for the reception also. I'll abuse my position by putting forth a question here, but I think we can do this as kind of a round. And so then you can kind of choose what you want to respond to out of all of this. So I'll just phrase my question very concisely for the purposes of time here. But to what extent do you see capital flight then as a kind of bug within a capitalist system, a global capitalist system? One related to bad governance, as you put it, or kind of an inherent feature, or a feature that almost feels inherent to how global capitalism, sort of actually existing global capitalism, functions. And then what are the implications of that for thinking then about the what to do question and how to address it? We'll take other questions. Yes, go ahead.
Mine is more of a quick question. Is the capital flight also observed in Rwanda?
Mm-hmm. And we can take one or two more before giving you a chance to respond. I'll go here.
I'm wondering what connection you may see, if any. We hear a lot of almost all over the continent guns. In that continent of Africa, I don't know any country, maybe South Africa, that manufactures bullets or guns, but it's a continent where children have more guns than bread. What is the connection? Is there any connection between this vicious system that is such a horrible structural violence you may see? And the story we read in textbooks or in classrooms is totally different. It's such a structural, misleading, pure lies. ethnic tribal people fighting, and no one almost is talking about exactly what's happening. Starve people, make sure that they live in total dehumanizing conditions, then give them guns. The same people, I suspect based on what you were saying, are going to be peacemakers in these countries. So I wonder what you think about this.
And we'll take one more.
Yeah, well, my question, thank you for that. I mean, I had similar thoughts about kind of militarism and the cycle of sort of civil conflicts as well as, the connections to there. But I'll ask a different question, which is, I mean, what is your estimation in terms of how much headway, one can make on this problem? In terms of, we can imagine that, there will never be a perfect world where there's no capital flight whatsoever, just given the fact that enforcement costs may be too high. What are your estimates about kind of policy changes and kind of the magnitude that they can make, whether it's kind of a quantitative estimate or kind of qualitatively what can be done about it?
Yes, if you want to take a few minutes to address what you can for a moment.
I'll do one question at a time. You want to start with Kevin's or you want me? Okay, so let's start. I'm sure Leonce will have something to say about this as well, but you're a great question, Kevin, about whether what we're describing is a bug or a feature. I would describe it as a feature. That said, bug versus feature doesn't quite capture, I think, the full picture of what we're looking at. I think what you really have is a process of conflict over how economies will operate, and over the control of how they operate, including the control of states and government policy. And that conflict, as I tried to suggest in that slide showing the different axes, although often conceptualized as north versus south, is overlaid on this other conflict between people who work and make their living through legitimate economic activity, often by labor, and people who abuse the opportunities that are available for appropriating, often in illegal or quasi-legal fashion. Sometimes it's legal too, because remember, the people who are the appropriators often are writing the rules as well, writing the laws. So not everything we're describing is illegal in the terms of the laws of the country where the appropriation is taking place. That said, the fact that so much of the money is going out clandestinely through capital flight, not showing up on the books, indicates that the people who are sending that money out are nervous, justifiably nervous, that they don't want it known that they have this money and took it out of the country and where it went. Why are they nervous? Because someday the phrase "make hay while the sun shines." Someday the political sun that enables their moment of plunder may change. They may be their people, their particular little network of power may fall from power. It happens. And at that point, people may come after them and come after their money. They want it in a safe place abroad. Now, within that conflict, then, there is really a question about what the ultimate trajectory is going to be. Is this feature of the plunder networks, as we describe them, is that going to kind of swallow the whole economy? Or is that going to be gradually shrunk? It may never be eliminated. There's organized crime, etc. But it could be potentially shrunk. And so whether it ends up, whether it turns out to be a feature that is permanent or not, is in play. It remains to be seen. And that kind of comes to Omar's question, which maybe I'll get back to after Léonce has said a few things.
Let me see. Let me start with this one, which is actually a question we hear many times. The question of whether Rwanda also has a problem of capital flight, which is more generally, who else? We talked about the big countries. Is that they're the only countries that suffer from capital flight? No. When we started our study on capital flight, we were looking at the case of the Congo, then Zaire under Mobutu, because we're interested in the institutional, historical drivers of that phenomenon. A government that had been known to be corrupt, but also well supported from the West, well financed from the West, rich. This was a very good case study, although it was waning. And then so we found a huge amount of capital, huge amount of debt that had come and disappeared. And then we said, why don't we look at other countries? I think our next study had like 30 countries, I can't remember the number. And we realized it's not just the Congo. It's a very systematic problem. Rwanda, for those who want to look at the studies that have done, that we can find it in the website of the Peripheral Economy Research Institute. They'll have a report that has the latest numbers up to 2018. Rwanda has, we estimated 21 billion for the 4 decades. You may say 21 billion is not big compared to 329 for South Africa, but also you have to think in terms of relative to the economy. That's not a negligible number. So if you look at those in terms of percentage of GDP, in fact, it's much, much higher than South Africa because it's a small economy. 25 billion makes comes out as a big number. And it shows that the problem of capital flight is not a problem of resource-rich countries only, because the issues that I have been describing about export misinvoicing, import misinvoicing can happen for both oil export, also tea export, copper export, import of automobile, anything. We can find that we find that they are sources of smuggling of capital goods. Let me just start the question from Deo, which also linked with Omar. One of the problems that we see with capital flight is this is illicit. It's movement of illicit money, but also illicit movement of money could have acquired it honestly and so on, which means that you don't know what it is used for. And that's one of the concerns, that money ends up financing illicit activities, including violence, the purchase of guns and other ammunition, because this is money that people have taken out of the country, are not registered by anybody, therefore not accountable to anybody. Therefore, you can use it to finance illicit activities, and that's a big concern. And also, it's related in the sense that, as we try to describe, capital flight is a manifestation of the failure of governance, a government that has failed to control the economy, which is a step towards failing to control the peace and security in the country. So they are interconnected in the sense that the vacuum of power, the vacuum of control facilitates capital flight. If you look at countries that have go through war, the economy doesn't stop, but it is the illegal economy that thrives. During the war in the Congo, as the Kabila rebellion was moving from the east to Côte, to Kinshasa, mining deals were being signed between the companies and the rebels. And then when Kabila took power, he said, oh my God, that was not good. So he wanted to renege on them. Of course, you know what happened. You don't renege. That's money. They'll kill you. That's what happened. So in a sense, lack of security, we think security is desirable. That's true. But for some people, security is not desirable in the sense that it changes the game. And if they have built wealth in a violent environment, they do not want peace because they control the game. And that's really that's a tragedy. That's why certain wars never seem to end. Insecurity seems to be the normal state of war.
Phenomenon sometimes described as war economies.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me turn to Omar's question, which was about the prospects for making headway in trying to combat the problems that we describe in the book, and that others, of course, have described as well. As I mentioned, there's others who work on this topic. And you can probably tell by looking at me that I've been around a little while, and I actually started working on this topic back during the Marcos, in the wake of the Marcos regime in the Philippines. Marcos was deposed in 1986. And when that happened, it was discovered that there was this massive hole in the debt statistics, and the country owed much more than had been known and what was to show for it. And it turned out a lot that had escaped his capital. Wrote about that. And at that time, so this is a way of giving you a sense of progress, right? Because in certain ways it's discouraging that we're still here now. I mean, I've been working on this stuff now for 40 years, and it's still, more than it's still not solved. But that said, things have changed, and there's been some progress. So I just want to highlight a few aspects of that. Back when I started, people didn't write about capital. There was very little work on this topic. It was kind of like what Henry Kissinger once is reputed to have said about Pinochet, which is that he may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch, right? The capital flight may be going on. People like Mobutu may be fleecing their economies and ultimately destabilizing, massive countries, but at least they're on our side in the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War, I think, began to open up a little bit of space for this topic to be discussed in polite company. And interestingly enough, among the spaces where it began to be discussed were international financial institutions, including the Bretton Woods institutions, the bank and the fund. And it was a difficult topic for them because they were kind of, often very closely involved with some of the same players that were involved in capital flight. Some of their own money was spinning through the revolving door. For the official donors, the fact that there was this hemorrhage of resources going on under the table while they were providing resources above the table was, at least by some of them, recognized as a problem. It's something we ought to talk about. So you began to see discussion of this problem in the 90s. And by the end of the 90s, you began to see moves towards dealing with the problem. Not doing much, but trying to increase transparency in the financial system, for example. The biggest obstruction to that was the US government. They were not interested in helping out. But by the end of the Clinton administration, we talk about this a bit in somewhere in our writings, I'm not sure if it's in this book. There was an agreement which the Bush administration, when it came in, proceeded to immediately pull out of, with the Treasury Secretary at the time famously saying, we don't want to make it easier for governments to tax their own citizens. Imagine a Treasury Secretary. That's like a finance minister, right? These are the people who are in charge. We don't want to make it easier for governments to tax their citizens. That changed after 9/11. So 9/11 gave a boost to efforts to pierce some of the veils of secrecy surrounding illicit financial flows, partly because those veils were also protecting terrorist finance. And so you began to see more movements in the first decade of the 2000s. And some progress was made. There were battles over this. There have always been battles over this, but gradually things have been improved. Banks in the United States now, so there's good news and bad news. Banks in the United States are required to file things called SAR, suspicious activity reports, when a large deposit of money comes in from an unexplained source, right? There are rules about when you have to report that. Well, that's a little bit of progress, but on the other hand, the Financial Information Center at Treasury that is meant to process these reports is completely understaffed and underfunded. And so thousands of reports come in, and from the standpoint of the banks, it's like, once we've submitted our report, we don't have to ask any questions. Yeah, bring me your money. I don't have any problem, because we reported it, and you don't have to worry about it. Moreover, that's banks, but then there are other vehicles through which illicit funds flow in, including trusts, including into real estate markets, many vehicles through which dirty money enters in search of safe havens, with safety being defined above all in terms of secrecy. People can't know who are the beneficial owners of these assets. And so it's an ongoing process, right? So it's kind of like, if you ask me, how do I feel about it? Having worked on this stuff now for almost 40 years, I have mixed feelings, right? I would have hoped that we would have gotten further than we have now. On the other hand, compared to where we were, we've come pretty far. A lot's been done. There's a lot more to be done. So this is not a problem that's going to be solved, at a stroke of a pen, or by electing one leader, or by waiting for somebody else to deal with it. And it's, of course, the task is complicated by the fact that you have very powerful actors on both sides of these transactions who have a lot of political clout, and who really, are really good at manipulating the system. And they can't hold off efforts to rein them in, they can find, ways to go around it. So it's an ongoing battle. I don't think the battle's going to be over in any of our lifetimes, right? But just because it's not going to be over in our lifetimes doesn't mean we shouldn't fight it, right? It's a challenge, right? For the younger folks in the audience, if you're looking for a cause,
Yeah.
this one won't let you down. This will keep you going until you're my age and further into the grave. But it'll be there. And there will always, it's like crime. Crime doesn't disappear, but sometimes it engulfs whole societies, and other times it's kind of under control. And that's what we're talking about here. This is crime, white collar crime.
And we should begin to wrap it up so that we can have time for informal conversation, snacks, beverages. Did you want to ask a quick?
Yeah. To what extent is the capital flight due to instability with people like currencies, the national currencies itself? Because I know a lot of these countries have hyperinflation, and if the capital flight is going towards the U.S., you guys have, I want to most stable currency regimes.
We actually, so when we began to try to understand what drives capital flight, the starting point was, let's just assume we can use economic finance theory to explain. What drives movement of money from a country to another is the search for higher return, safer returns. So we do the analysis and we look at, does exchange rate instability, interest rate differential, do they tend to drive capital flight? We find no evidence. Because remember, when you actually now go into the details about who is involved and what are the motives, people who acquire the money that they want to hide, they really are not interested in the differential in returns. They want the money to get out and be hidden. And they are willing to take losses in terms of rates of return for protecting the money. Let me give you an anecdote, and then I'll try to make it quick short. My first trip to Panama was going to a conference, and then it's a beautiful place. I had only read it in the book. the book. So after 2 days going to restaurants and looking at everything, I asked the driver, a taxi driver who's from Spain but had lived there for many, many years. He says, tell me, how come every time we go for dinner, we find it's a big restaurant, they have the whole floor, very fancy chairs and they have like 15, 20 waitresses, and we find we have 2 teams, 5 here and 10. I said, how do they make money? He says, we don't understand. You want to run a restaurant? They can give you another floor for free. I said, wow, because their job, their purpose is not to make money, it's to hide the money in the building. So for people who have money that they store, can't explain, really it's not financial calculus that drive them. Another exercise that people have done is whether, for example, political changes, instability drive capital flight. Yes, but not the systematic outflow. Because what we find is that it's not like in 1 year there's a lot of capital flight and then it stops. We find that it keeps going. If it was this kind of outburst of insecurity, then we will see capital flight in 2-3 years and then it goes down. Which means that there are bigger structural problems that drive capital flight, and one is theft. Money people acquire with that they can't document, that they have to hide away. And in that case, they are willing to pay the lawyers and the accountants and not make money. But you store millions and millions and millions, you don't need to worry about interest rates or stability of exchange. Of course, the reason they put it in hard currency is not really because the currencies are more stable than their own country. They just happen to be outside of the country. Even if their own, for example, even if Angolan currency became very, very stable, capital flight will continue to happen.
Well, and some places have the ability to hold foreign currency accounts for those who are rich enough to want to do so. But those are, above ground visible accounts, but you can have an account in the bank that's in hard currency. And so it's not just about hedging against devaluation. There's a lot more going on in the picture. And, in some cases, people with money they want to hide are willing to accept negative interest rates. There are banks that pay negative interest rates, particularly in Switzerland. This was historically the case, because the people are really, they're willing to pay the bank for the service the bank is providing, which is secrecy, which is making it hard for people to track down that money. And it's like a service, and from the bank standpoint, they're willing to sell that service, and they make their money by the difference between what they pay depositors and what they pay lenders, and they're paying negative interest rates sometimes. So it's the strongest predictors in the econometric work we've done, looking at when we've looked at differential interest rates, inflation rates, a bunch of stuff to try to understand what is it that correlates with capital flight, not in this book, but in work we've done in the past. And the strongest predictors are external borrowing, which sets up the most lootable of all resources, which is foreign money coming in and spitting out through a financial revolving door as money is diverted and borrowed with either by the state or with a public guarantee and diverted into offshore accounts, a phenomenon that Cheryl Taylor here wrote a book about years ago called Rent and Loss. That's one very strong predictor of the amount of capital flight. And another one is natural resource exports. The oil in Africa is strongly correlated with capital flight. Diamonds, minerals, these are major sectors these are kind of happy hunting grounds for resource appropriation. So those are really the biggies when you look at this from an econometric standpoint. That's where a lot of the flow is coming out.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Leonce.